Some decisions the judicial system makes are shocking, and it's not always clear how they are made. A skilled lawyer can manipulate the facts so well that even the jurors can't tell the difference between right and wrong. Candy Lynn Wheeler was born on November 15, 1949. She grew up in a military family, frequently moving to different places during her childhood. From an early age, her loved ones called her Candy. Those who knew her described her as a very charismatic person. At 20, she met a man named Pat Montgomery. The two met at work. Both were employed by a company that produced tools and equipment in the 1970s. Pat worked as an engineer, and Candy was a secretary. Pat was responsible, hardworking, and had a decent salary. It seemed like he could provide stability and comfort for both of them, turning their dreams into reality. However, at first, their relationship didn't take off. Candy didn't find Pat physically attractive, and he seemed rather reserved. Things changed when she learned how much he earned. Rumors from friends and family gave her a different view of Pat's potential. She decided to give him a chance. Other witnesses of their relationship stated that from the start, their connection was based on real love. In 1977, they decided to marry, and a few months later, they moved to a small town in Wiley, Texas, with a population of just 3,000 people at the time. It was a quiet, provincial town with a low crime rate, a perfect place for a peaceful family life. Candy Montgomery was seen as a loving wife and mother, living a perfect suburban life with her husband Pat and their two children in their new home. She became well known as a typical American housewife, active in social life, attending church, and even singing in the local choir. She was also a member of the parent committee and quickly gained the respect of the local community. Despite the outward appearance of an ideal life, some close to the couple thought Candy had grown unhappy in her marriage. Her friends knew that the spark the couple once had seemed to be gone, and her family life was no longer as smooth as it had been in the early stages of their relationship. Though their life seemed perfect to outsiders, the couple's relationship started showing signs of strain. While Pat seemed to provide a stable life, Candy began to grow restless. Her interest in the daily routine waned, and she started seeking excitement elsewhere. She eventually decided to have an affair, and this choice would lead to disaster. Candy had her best friend Betty, and she became attracted to her husband, Alan Gore. The two met during social events in town, and unlike her relationship with Pat, Candy immediately found Alan appealing. Betty had met Alan during college, where she worked as a teaching assistant. Though Betty's family had initially disapproved of Alan, the two fell in love and married. Alan was a hard-working, devoted family man, but he often had to travel for work. Betty, who hated these separations, became increasingly anxious and possessive of her husband. In time, Betty's behavior became more obsessive. She began calling Alan's boss, asking him not to send Alan on business trips. Eventually, this escalated, and Betty started regularly contacting Alan's manager during his work travels. Her behavior led many to believe she was suffering from depression, and she started to avoid herself from others. During this time, Candy became closer to Alan. They eventually found themselves deeply attracted to each other, and after a volleyball game in October 1978, Candy expressed her feelings to Alan. The affair quickly began. They set strict boundaries to keep their relationship's physical and emotional distance minimal. Their affair continued for nearly a year, during which both of them maintained their marriages. But over time, Candy began to grow emotionally attached to Alan, and Alan, too, started to feel conflicted. Their affair led to more frequent doubts and confusion about their respective marriages. Eventually, Alan decided to reconcile with his wife Betty and put an end to his affair with Candy. Despite their previous agreement, Candy felt betrayed and devastated by Alan's decision. She began to feel abandoned and angry, as she had not anticipated him ending things. Despite their initial arrangement, Candy had developed real feelings for him. After this, Pat discovered a greeting card addressed to Candy from Alan. He didn't get angry at her, but instead blamed himself for neglecting his wife and not giving her enough attention. Meanwhile, Betty remained unaware of the affair, and Pat decided to follow Alan's path. He also enrolled with Candy in a church program designed to improve marital relationships, hoping to save their marriage. This was only the beginning of the story that would ultimately lead to a horrible turn in their lives. Betty didn't know what had happened yet, but everything changed on Friday, June 13th, 1980. At 10 a.m., Candy went to her best friend's house to pick up a swimsuit for her older daughter. That day, after that, Candy simply went home, continuing her day as usual. The children of the family, along with their guest Alice, went to church in the evening and then to the cinema to watch a new movie. At the same time, Alan was on another business trip. He tried several times to call his wife on the home phone, but no one answered. This worried the man. As usually, she was waiting for his calls and sometimes calling herself multiple times an hour. Suddenly she stopped answering, which was completely unlike her, and worried her husband. Of course, he knew that Betty was Candy's best friend, so he called his former lover. She answered that she had stopped by earlier to pick up the swimsuit for his daughter, but had been unable to reach his wife. So Alan contacted a few neighbors, asking them to check if everything was all right. It was already late in the evening when 3 of the neighbors went to the house and knocked, but no one responded. They then walked around the outside of the house with flashlights. There was nothing suspicious, so they entered the house. The door was unlocked. Everything seemed normal inside. Things were where they should be. On the kitchen table were 2 half-drunk cups, but no one responded to calls. Only the sound of a child crying came from the basement. Going downstairs, they made a terrifying discovery. In a pool of her own blood, Betty was found lifeless, her body almost unrecognizable. At first it was hard to understand what caused her death, as such injuries could result from several point-blank shots with a shotgun. It was clear, though, that this was a violent murder. Betty's body was so disfigured that it was only identified by post-mortem dental records. Even this was difficult since the skull bones and flesh were destroyed. One of her arms, likely raised to cover her face, was nearly severed. Most of the wounds were inflicted after her death, and they weren't very strong, as if the attacker were a teenager or a very fragile woman of short stature who had trouble delivering each blow. The brutality of the attack clearly suggested that the assailant was familiar with the victim. This was a very personal attack. This theory was supported by the lack of signs of robbery or sexual assault, so these motives were ruled out. On the table near the victim, forensic experts found Betty's blood on a newspaper, open to an ad for the movie The Shining by Stanley Kubrick, in which Jack Nicholson stalks a victim with an axe. It was assumed that the film might have inspired the crime. What was unusual, however, was that the murderer took a shower in the victim's house. The bathroom was covered in blood, including the rug, curtains, tiles, and plumbing. However, DNA samples did not help the police at that time. This horrific murder was a great shock to everyone in the town. The local residents knew each other well, and the crime rate was almost non-existent. People were scared, thinking that some murderer with an axe might be wandering their streets. The residents tried to help the police catch the brutal criminal, but no one had seen anything. Given the technology of the time, forensic experts had little to work with. There were no surveillance cameras, no mobile phone geolocations. The police examined the closest circle of Betty's relatives and neighbors, but everyone had an alibi. Upon learning of the tragedy, Alan immediately called Candy, knowing that his older daughter was staying at her house. He asked if the child was all right and shared about what had happened to his wife. The former lover behaved very calmly. She seemed just as shocked by the brutality of the murder as Alan. She understood that the police would soon come to ask her a few questions and was ready to cooperate in finding the criminal responsible for the death of her best friend. Meanwhile, the news of the murder spread throughout the city, and some people tried to help in the investigation while others demanded that the murderer have to be found quickly to ensure the streets were safe. People knew that a brutal criminal was still free. Forensics continued working at the murder site, trying to collect any evidence that might link everything together, but there were almost no fingerprints or other clues. DNA testing at that point was something that could only be found in science fiction. The investigators didn't leave empty-handed. They found one fingerprint on the refrigerator door and a bloody footprint with a clear tread. After the murder, the killer had calmly taken a shower and didn't even try to remove any evidence of the violent crime. Given the extreme violence, investigators considered the victim's husband, Alan, the primary suspect. After all, spousal murders were not uncommon, and it was believed that the attack was a crime of passion. The police asked Alan about possible affairs, but he lied, claiming he had been faithful to his wife. He also denied that she could have found out about the affair. After the interrogation, he was released. However, the next day he called the police again and admitted to lying about the affair. It was this confession that led detectives to discover his relationship with Betty's best friend, Candy. Furthermore, Alan claimed that he had ended the affair on his own. This seemed to provide a motive. According to him, Candy had planned to stop by his wife's house that day to pick up the swimsuit for her daughter. Investigators realized that Candy was the last person to see Betty alive, and her visit coincided with the time of death. However, Alan's alibi was solid. He was guaranteed to be on a business trip out of town at the time of the murder. Now, Candy has become the prime suspect. She was brought in for questioning. She admitted that she had indeed visited Betty's house that morning. They had chatted and had coffee, and according to the main suspect, nothing unusual happened. She left with the swimsuit about half an hour later. She didn't deny the affair, but confirmed that the two lovers had broken up a while ago. Both claimed that Betty had no knowledge of the betrayal, but the detectives were skeptical, feeling that Candy was withholding information. The forensic expert determined that the murderer was likely a teenager or a frail woman, which fit Candy's profile. They also suggested that she take a polygraph test, which she refused. Her refusal only strengthened the police's suspicions. However, the doubts left when fingerprints found at the scene of the crime were matched to Candy's. After that, she was arrested on suspicion of murder. She called the only lawyer she knew in town, the only lawyer in the area. On June 26th, she was charged with murder, but her husband posted a $100,000 bond the very next day, and she was released. The investigation continued for a week, during which time her lawyer began working on a defense strategy as a trial was beginning. The whole town was shocked by who the brutal killer turned out to be, but many couldn't believe it, and even helped Alan raise the bond money. There was not a single person who could imagine Candy with an axe in her hands, chopping up her best friend. Of course, the main suspect denied her involvement in Betty's death, but later, on her lawyer's advice, she admitted to the attack, claiming she had been in a state of mental shock. According to the law of the state, this could help her avoid punishment. This case was so widely covered by the media that it became nearly impossible to find anyone in the small town who didn't know Candy or the story. The jury included 3 people who knew the defendant personally, and the lawyer had been working on the case for years. The only person who could tell what had happened at the crime scene was Candy herself. According to her, she went to Betty's house to get the swimsuit. They started talking, and suddenly Betty confessed that she had slept with her husband. Betty started accusing her of betrayal, but then calmed down. After that, Betty said she was going to the basement for some things and would bring them down to her guest. But instead, Candy followed her, and Betty unexpectedly attacked her with the axe. Candy was injured in the foot, and a fight started. Betty continued swinging the axe, and Candy tried to defend herself with her hands. At one point, Betty hit her on the head, and Candy felt as if her scalp was being cut off. She then blacked out. When she regained consciousness, she was in the bathroom, washing off the blood. She put on Betty's clothes and left. The defense lawyer argued that the defendant was in a state of shock and therefore could not control her actions when she killed Betty. The prosecutor, however, believed that this was premeditated murder driven by jealousy. There were no injuries on Betty that could be interpreted as signs of self-defense, apart from a scratch on the foot. The trial began on October 20th, 1980. More than 200 people filled the courtroom. On the defense side, numerous witnesses spoke, including pastors and church members, who described the defendant as a wonderful mother, wife, and person. Candy herself confidently and clearly testified, answering all questions without hesitation or doubt. During the trial, an independent psychiatrist from Houston was invited, who even used hypnosis to support the defense. The psychiatrist tried to prove that the defendant, due to the attack by Betty, had experienced a dissociative reaction and that she had fallen into an unconscious state of rage because of the trauma. It turned out that there had been an incident in her childhood related to a blow to the head. Candy attacked with an axe, hitting her on the toe and foot. They fought, and at some point Betty told Candy something that, according to the psychiatrist, brought up unpleasant childhood memories for Candy. Her mother had done something similar during a certain incident in her childhood, which triggered a painful psychological reaction. The independent expert agreed that Candy had killed her friend without realizing what was happening. Candy's husband also supported his wife in court. The husband of the murdered woman, Alan, explained that in the last days of Betty's life, her condition had worsened again. She suffered from postpartum depression and was constantly irritated. She suspected her husband of cheating, though he denied it. By that time, he had already ended his affair with Candy. The defense lawyer seized on Alan's words, believing that they provided convincing evidence of Betty's insanity, which stemmed from her husband's infidelity and her attempt to kill her rival. All these arguments convinced the jury. Candy's verdict was not guilty. After the 5-hour session, she showed no emotion when the verdict was read. The relatives and close ones of the victim shouted angry remarks at her. This case became the first criminal case that her lawyer worked on, and it was an overwhelming success for the defense attorney. However, rumors circulated that the outcome was influenced by the fact that at least 3 of the jurors were acquaintances. Soon after the trial, Alan remarried, and later had both of his daughters with him. Some rumors suggested that this was due to the harsh treatment their father displayed after the death of his wife. Alan's second marriage also did not last long. Candy and Pet Montgomery could not stay in the town for long. Naturally, the local community contributed to their desire to leave, and they moved to Georgia with the children in hopes of starting a new life. Over the years, the couple tried to keep their family together, maintaining contact with one another, but ultimately, they separated. Afterward, Candy reclaimed her maiden name to keep her identity secret. She began working as a psychotherapist with her daughter, Jenny, to help people struggling with depression. Candy never had legal issues again and was happy to help others. Thank you for your support. Take care of yourselves and see you next time on the channel. Thank you for watching.